The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. April sunlight slanted through the tall windows of Marion County Courthouse in Salem, Oregon, spilling across the rows of wooden benches packed with neighbors, journalists, and faces I didn't recognize. The sound of the judge's gavel echoed like a heartbeat against the walls. I stood in the center of that room with a small flash drive clenched in my hand, so tight my knuckles burned. 10 years. 10 years of silence. 10 years of pretending. 10 years of living under the shadow of the man they were bringing through those doors. When the bailiff pushed Douglas Quinn into the room, shackles clinking softly against the polished floor, every muscle in my body tightened. He didn't look at me at first. His chin was tilted up in that same quiet arrogance that used to fill every corner of our house when I was a child. But then, his gaze caught mine. For a split second, I saw something flicker behind those eyes. Not guilt, not fear. Something colder, a recognition of a war he thought he had already won. I took a slow breath and raised my chin. The judge spoke my name. Reporters lifted their phones. Vivian sat 3 rows back in a neat beige coat, her pearl earrings shining in the light. She had always loved clean surfaces, even when blood was invisible. The courtroom smelled like polish and dust and old wood, but underneath it all, I could still taste the wet iron scent of that night. It lived in the back of my throat like a brand. I had spent years trying to wash it away. Now I was here to let it speak for me. My heart hammered so hard I thought someone could hear it. I felt the cool surface of the flash drive press into my skin. Inside, it was everything I had collected, everything they didn't know I had. It held the night that ended my childhood and the night I stopped being afraid. The judge's voice blurred for a moment. All I heard was the soft scrape of Douglas's shoes on the floor as they guided him toward the defense table. He finally turned his full face toward me. His lips twitched upward in the faintest smile. That same smile he used when he told me years ago that family secrets stay buried. But secrets rot, and rot stinks. The jury shifted in their seats. The reporter from the Salem Herald whispered into a mic. Someone coughed. I felt the courtroom shrink and expand at the same time. For years, I had played my part, the quiet girl who survived the one who kept her head down. But the silence wasn't loyalty. It was strategy. I could still remember the sound of my mother's voice the night before everything ended. It wasn't a scream. It was the sound of someone trying not to break. That sound never left me, and today it wasn't just in my head. It was the foundation under my feet. My fingers stopped trembling. My spine straightened. Vivian's eyes met mine from the benches. There was something sharp in her stare, as if she wanted to peel me open and drag me back to the little girl who never spoke up, but that girl was gone. I thought of the night rain tapping against the roof of the cold tiles beneath my bare feet, of the way my hands had smelled like soap and fear. I thought of the way he said my name back then. Soft, fake, final. And I smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile that belonged to someone who had forgiven. It was the kind of smile that belonged to someone who had learned to build a trap and wait. Miss Quinn, the judge, called again. I stepped forward. Each sound was sharp, the heels of my shoes against the wood. The breath caught somewhere in my throat, the whisper of the USB chain brushing against my palm. I looked at Douglas. The past sat between us like a loaded weapon. I was no longer a child hiding in corners. I was the storm coming through the door, and he knew it. His smile faltered. For the first time in 10 years, his eyes widened. That was the first crack. The first hint that the world he built on lies was finally beginning to shake. I raised the flash drive slowly and handed it to the bailiff. The judge nodded. The clerk moved. The monitor blinked alive, and I saw his jaw tighten. That's when I knew the war had just begun. 10 years ago, he thought the truth died with her. But today, it breathes through me. Where are you watching from? Drop your city and time zone below, because what happened next changed everything. The air that September night was heavy, almost sticky the way it gets when the wind carries the scent of wet earth and something else that never leaves a house once it enters. Our family's farmhouse sat just outside Salem, surrounded by trees that creaked in the dark like they knew what was coming. I was 12. I didn't have the words for what control looked like, but I could feel it in every quiet corner of our home. It lived in the way my mother moved around Douglas, careful, measured, always holding her breath before speaking. It lived in the way my brother Ethan avoided looking him in the eye, and it lived in the way I flinched at the sound of boots on the wooden floor. Douglas Quinn wasn't the kind of man who yelled at first. He started small, like smoke creeping through the cracks of a door. He took over the checkbook, then the passwords, then the mailbox. He made sure every bill passed through his hands before anyone else saw it. One by one, the doors to our world closed, and he stood with the key in his pocket. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my math homework, hearing my mother's voice tremble in the next room as she asked him why she wasn't allowed to access her own bank account anymore. His voice was calm, too, calm the kind that made your stomach twist. He said it was safer this way, that women didn't always make good decisions. That was the first time I saw Ethan clench his fists under the table. He was 16 and already taller than Douglas, but he never spoke back. Not after that night last summer when Douglas grabbed him by the collar and shoved him against the door for laughing at something during dinner. The silence after that incident became the new language of our house. At night, the walls felt thinner. I would hear the glasses break long before I heard the shouting. I would hear the soft sound of my mother crying when she thought we were asleep. And sometimes I would hear the creak of the old farmhouse floorboards as Douglas paced like a wolf that owned the cage. He didn't hit her in the way people imagine when they talk about violence. He didn't need to. He used fear like a leash, a look, a slammed door, a voice that could make the house freeze. The night everything changed started like so many others. My mother Margaret had made stew. Ethan sat across from me, not talking, stirring his spoon like the bowl had all the answers. Douglas walked in late, smelling like bourbon and cologne. His jacket was still on. He didn't like when we started dinner without him. I could see the muscle in his jaw twitch as his eyes swept the table. My mother whispered something, maybe an apology I couldn't hear. Then the bowl shattered. He didn't throw it at her. He just dropped it on the floor and let it explode at her feet. She knelt down quickly to clean it up. He didn't move. He watched her pick up every piece. Ethan stood halfway up from his chair, but I grabbed his wrist under the table. We had both learned that trying to step in made it worse. The sound of the wind outside pushed against the windows. I still remember that sound like the house itself was listening. Later that night, after we were supposed to be asleep, I heard them in the kitchen. His voice was low, dangerous. Hers was shaking, begging. I crept to the top of the stairs, bare feet against the cold wood, and saw him holding a folder in one hand and a pen in the other. My mother was sitting at the table, shoulders shaking, mascara streaked down her cheeks. I didn't understand then what the papers were, but I would learn years later that it was the deed to the property. Her name was about to disappear from the home she grew up in. He leaned down, whispered something close to her ear, something that made her hands tremble as she reached for the pen. She signed. He smiled. Then the glass broke again. I don't even remember moving. One moment I was at the top of the stairs, the next I was in the kitchen doorway. I shouted his name, but it came out small, like a breath trapped inside my throat. He turned slow, like I was an insect that had wandered into his space. His eyes weren't angry. They were cold. That was worse. I stepped closer. Ethan's voice called my name from upstairs. I remember his footsteps pounding down behind me. When I grabbed my mother's arm, Douglas didn't yell. He just moved my hand away with the back of his own. The edge of his ring hit the side of my wrist. Pain shot up my arm like fire. I stumbled back, clutching my hand. Ethan reached the doorway a second later, but Douglas was already standing tall, looking at both of us with that quiet, controlled smile. He said one sentence that I will never forget. "This house will always be mine." The next morning, the bruise on my wrist was already dark purple. My mother didn't look at it. She didn't look at me at all. She stood at the sink, washing the same cup over and over. Ethan sat next to me, hands balled into fists. I knew he wanted to run. I wanted to run too, but Douglas had already changed the locks the month before. That weekend, my mother stopped leaving the house. She stopped calling her friends. The neighbors came by once with a pie. He told them we were busy. They didn't come again. On September 12th, 2015, the wind came back. It pushed through the cracks of the old house, howling against the windows. That night, the shouting didn't stop. I was on the stairs again when I heard her cry out. Ethan was already at the door when I reached the hallway. We both saw Douglas push her. It wasn't a shove. It was one step too many backward on the slick kitchen floor. The sound of her body hitting the tile is something that still wakes me at night. The ambulance lights painted the walls red and blue. Neighbors stood outside the gate whispering. An officer asked me if I had family to stay with. I remember staring at my bare feet and shaking my head. Ethan's arms were around me, but I couldn't feel anything. I watched them lift my mother onto the stretcher, her hair covering half her face. She was breathing, but small, too small. Douglas stood at the end of the driveway, hands in his pockets, watching like it was a scene he owned. That night was the first time I understood that silence could scream louder than anything else. It crawled under my skin into my bones and settled there. And in that silence, something inside me broke, and something else began to build. I didn't know it yet, but the girl standing barefoot on the porch, watching the ambulance disappear down the road, was never coming back. After my mother's funeral, the house felt colder even when the sun was out. Douglas made sure the papers were signed fast. There were no long discussions, no family debates, just a few meetings behind closed doors with his lawyer, and then a single afternoon when I sat on a hard chair in the county building while someone handed me a pen and a packet of forms that I barely understood. By the end of that week, he had filed for legal guardianship. By the end of the month, my last name was officially Quinn. I remember staring at the new ID card they mailed to the house. Ember Quinn. The name looked like it belonged to someone else. Someone quieter, someone who knew better than to fight. Ethan had turned 17 and was sent to a boarding program out of state. Douglas said it was to give him opportunities, but the look in Ethan's eyes the day he left told me what it really was. Divide and control. Without him there, the house got quieter in a way that was different from before. It wasn't the silence that followed yelling anymore. It was a silence built like a cage. Everything from that moment on was permission. I didn't own a single decision. He set up a bank account in my name, but kept the card in his desk. He chose the school a private academy 30 minutes away, strict uniforms, strict curfews, and a code of conduct that felt like it was written just for me. He arranged the carpool, the allowance, the clothes, the tutors. He never raised his voice again. He didn't have to. His control didn't come in waves. It came like air pressure pressing against your lungs until breathing itself felt like asking. Every time I asked for something simple like staying late after a class project or walking to the corner store, he would tilt his head, smile without warmth, and say, "Don't forget who saved you." The words wrapped around me like a leash. He never said it with cruelty. He said it like a reminder, like a fact I couldn't rewrite. It worked. Over time, my tongue learned how to freeze before my mind even formed the questions. Vivian arrived the summer after he filed the adoption. She came into our lives like a soft shadow. Blonde hair in a neat twist, pearl earrings that caught the light, a perfume that smelled faintly of rose and smoke. She was polite. She was quiet. And she never once looked at me the way a woman should look at a child living in her house. She looked at me like I was an accessory in a room she hadn't decorated yet. Her smile was smooth but empty. I could tell from the way she moved that she understood exactly what kind of man Douglas was. She just didn't care. She slipped into the role of stepmother like someone stepping into a tailored coat. She stood behind him during school events, dinners, holiday photos. Always there, never intervening. She wasn't the kind who raised her voice or laid hands. She was the kind who turned her face away and let the quiet do the damage for her. The first year passed like that. I learned how to disappear without leaving the room. I learned how to nod at the right time, how to shrink my voice into polite answers, how to keep my eyes low enough to avoid confrontation, but not low enough to be called disrespectful. I learned that some cages don't need locks. They just need your fear to hold them closed. I went to school, came home, sat at a dinner table where Douglas led every conversation, decided every detail of my life like a man adjusting the pieces of a puzzle that only he could see. Vivian sat on the opposite end, legs crossed, smile fixed. Sometimes at night, when the house was still, I would lie awake and count the seconds between the sounds of his footsteps downstairs. He had a pattern. 3 steps into the kitchen. Pause. Cabinet door opening. Glass on the counter. Ice clinking. Bourbon poured. He drank alone most nights, and the house held its breath with him. I learned to breathe in shallow sips of air so the floor wouldn't creak. I learned to be invisible. When I turned 14, I asked if I could spend the summer with my aunt in Portland. She was my mother's sister. He stared at me for a long time, as if the question itself was a betrayal. Then he said, "No one out there is going to take better care of you than me." It wasn't shouted, it was whispered, the kind of whisper that makes your stomach twist. I nodded. That was what he wanted. Compliance. And in that moment, I understood that I could scream and it would echo inside these walls, but it would never reach the world outside. Vivian started hosting charity luncheons in the garden. Women from town gathered under white tents, sipping sparkling water, laughing too loudly. I would walk past them on my way to school. Their eyes slid over me, polite, distant. To them, I was the girl lucky to have been saved by the town's successful man. The story they believed was cleaner than the truth. It always is. No one asked questions. No one ever does when the house is pretty on the outside. The rules grew without being spoken. I couldn't leave the city without permission. I couldn't have a cell phone without it being registered in his name. He told the school nurse to call him not me for everything. He controlled every door that might have let out. And every time I even thought about pushing back, I could see the flicker of something in his eyes. Not rage, power. He liked watching me calculate how much trouble my defiance might cost me. He liked the quiet that followed. The only letters I ever got from Ethan came from a P.O. box with no return address. He wrote about his classes, about the people he met, about the music he was listening to. He never wrote about Douglas. He didn't have to. Between every line, the silence said enough. I hid those letters under the loose floorboard near my bed. Every time I touched them, I felt a part of myself that hadn't completely vanished. By 15, I had stopped asking for anything. I moved through each day like a ghost in my own life. School, home, dinner, quiet, repeat. The teachers said I was polite. The neighbors said I was lucky. Douglas said I was safe. But safety in his mouth was a lie wearing a suit. It wasn't safety. It was ownership. I knew then that if I ever wanted to survive this place, I couldn't fight him head on. He didn't need to bruise me to break me. He had built a world where every escape route was already sealed, where every breath of freedom had to pass through him first. And so, I learned something that would save me years later. I learned how to make silence my armor. I learned how to smile when I needed to hide. I learned how to wait, because waiting was the only weapon he didn't see coming. And inside that waiting, something sharp was growing, something that would one day cut through every wall he built around me. I was 17 when the first crack appeared. Not the kind you see in the wall of an old house, not something obvious or loud, but the kind that lives in silence like a whisper splitting the air. It was late winter in Salem. The rain hadn't stopped for days, the kind of rain that makes the air feel like a wet cloth wrapped around your face. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a history book open, pretending to study, when I heard the door slam. Douglas stumbled in, soaked through his jacket, dripping onto the hardwood floor. His face was flushed, his breath thick with bourbon. I could always tell when he had been drinking too much. His movements slowed down, but his words came sharp and slick, like a blade he liked to polish. I braced myself for the usual quiet commands, but that night something was different. He was angry at me, or at something else I wasn't sure. His voice rose the kind of rise that made the house stop breathing. He said my name. Then he said another. A woman's name. Not my mother's. Not Vivian's. Someone else. It cut through me like the wind slicing through rain. He didn't even realize it. He just kept talking, kept blaming me for the dishes not being put away, for the silence he claimed was disrespectful. But that name hung in the air like smoke. I didn't answer. I didn't flinch. I just watched him stumble toward the study at the end of the hallway. He slammed the door behind him. Vivian didn't come down. She never did when he was like this. She stayed upstairs behind closed doors, pretending not to hear. The house smelled like damp wool and bourbon. I sat at the table until the grandfather clock in the living room struck midnight. Then I stood up. My hands cold, my chest tight, with a kind of quiet fury I didn't have a name for yet. His office door was always locked, but I had learned things about Douglas over the years. His patterns, his habits. He was meticulous when sober, but careless when drunk. That night, he hadn't locked the door. The light was still on, spilling a dull yellow glow into the hallway. I pushed the door slowly, the hinges creaking softly, a sound that made my pulse hammer against my ribs. His office was exactly the way I had imagined it when I was younger, standing on the other side of the door. It smelled like cigars, expensive leather, and control. Everything was in its place. A neat stack of folders on the mahogany desk, a decanter with amber liquid half gone, a heavy safe against the wall. His desk drawers lined up like soldiers. I stepped inside barefoot, the wood cool against my feet. I had no plan, just instinct. My fingers moved without asking my mind for permission. I opened the bottom drawer first. Bills, contracts, insurance forms. I dug deeper. Then I found a thin manila folder with my mother's handwriting on the corner. Margaret Quinn. I froze. For a second, the room blurred. I sat on the floor, my fingers shaking as I pulled the papers out. The first page was a copy of the property deed, but it wasn't what Douglas had told me years ago. It wasn't what the lawyer said when they made him my guardian. The original deed had my mother's name, and her will, the one she had supposedly signed over to him, wasn't in his name. It was in mine and Ethan's. I stared at the black ink like it might rearrange itself into something else, something less dangerous. It didn't. My throat went dry. Every word he had ever said about saving me, every reminder about what I owed him, cracked like old paint. He had never saved me. He had stolen everything. My hands kept moving. I searched through the rest of the drawer and found something heavier, colder. A small black camcorder wrapped in a plastic bag. Dust clung to the corners like it had been hiding there for years. My heart lurched, the kind of lurch that makes your stomach twist into knots. I sat on the floor, holding the camera, staring at the small red sticker my mother had once put on it to mark it as family recordings. The last time I remembered seeing that camera was the summer before everything fell apart. She used it to record Ethan's school project and a picnic at the creek. She loved that camera. When she disappeared from it, I thought the world had swallowed it too, but it was here, hidden in his office. My fingers brushed the buttons, and the old plastic felt cold and alive in my hands. I pressed the power button. The small screen flickered weakly to life. The battery was nearly dead, but it still worked. The first file was dated September 12, 2015. The night my childhood ended, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain outside. My breath caught shallow and quick. I didn't press play, not yet. My hands shook too much. I slipped the camera into the front pocket of my hoodie and shoved the papers back into the folder. I knew I couldn't leave them there. He would notice eventually, but I also knew this was the first real piece of the truth I had touched in years. When I left the office, the house was silent. The kind of silence that feels like it's listening. I crept up the stairs, my heart beating too loudly, terrified that he might still be awake, but the door to the master bedroom was closed, and the snore that came through it was low and uneven. He was passed out. I stood outside that door for a second, clutching the camera, staring at the wood grain. All the stories he had fed me, all the control he had built around me started to splinter. In my room, I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I stared at the camera, at the date on the tiny, flickering screen. I knew what I was holding was dangerous. If I pressed play, everything could change. The truth doesn't come quietly. It crashes. It tears. It ruins what's left of the lies holding everything together. I pressed play. The screen was grainy, the image shaky, but I could see the kitchen. I could see my mother's face, pale, terrified. Douglas's voice filled the room, low and cruel. And then I heard it. The sound that had haunted me in the dark for years. The sound of her hitting the floor. I snapped the screen shut so hard it hurt my hand. My breath was ragged, my eyes burning. It was real. It had always been real. The truth I had been told to bury was sitting right in my hands. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark listening to the rain hammer against the roof, replaying his words over and over in my head. Don't forget who saved you. He had said it 100 times, but now I knew what he really meant. Don't forget what I took. The next morning, I went through the motions as if nothing had changed. Breakfast, school uniform, quiet nods. But everything inside me had shifted. I watched him pour his coffee, straighten his tie, kiss Vivian on the cheek, and smile like the world belonged to him. But for the first time, I saw the cracks. Small, hairline, barely visible, but there. And I knew if I pushed, they would spread. He had built his empire on silence, and I had been silent long enough. Something sharp had started to grow inside me, not loud, not wild, but steady and patient and dangerous. The day I turned 18, the air outside smelled different. I still remember standing at the edge of the campus in Portland with the wind brushing my hair back, the weight of my bags cutting into my shoulders, and for the first time in years, there wasn't a shadow of his boots creaking behind me. College wasn't freedom, not really. It was distance, and distance was the first crack in his cage. Douglas had paid for the tuition, of course. He liked control too much to let me build a life on my own. He set up a shared account for expenses, gave me rules, made sure I knew every cent would be tracked. But what he didn't understand was that the moment I walked through that gate, something inside me shifted. I wasn't just away, I was awake. My first months in Portland were quiet. Too quiet. I followed his rules like a good daughter on the surface. Weekly calls, expense reports, good grades. But underneath that quiet, something was moving. The night before I left Salem, I had copied the footage from the old camcorder onto a small USB drive. I kept it buried deep in the lining of my jacket, close enough to feel it press against my skin like a reminder. I hadn't told anyone. Not Ethan, not a friend, no one. Secrets are safest in the hands of the person who has nothing left to lose. In late October, after weeks of walking past the same corner cafe, I finally pushed the door of a small law office tucked between an antique shop and a florist on Hawthorne Boulevard. The name etched on the frosted glass read Avery Cole. She had been my mother's lawyer. I remembered her face from years ago, a kind woman with sharp eyes who had hugged me after the funeral when everyone else avoided my gaze. She looked older now, her hair streaked with silver, but her voice was the same low calm. I told her who I was. She blinked as if pulling me from a photograph she had folded away years ago. When I slid the copied deed and the USB across her desk, something in her eyes changed. She didn't ask how I got them. She just said I always knew something was wrong. We spent hours in that small office with its mismatched furniture and the faint smell of paper and ink. She pulled out old files I didn't know she still kept. She showed me how Douglas had amended the documents 3 days after my mother's fall, how signatures had been forged, how assets had been quietly transferred. Every page felt like someone pulling bricks out of the walls he had built around me. Avery warned me. He has power in Salem, friends, money. If you make a move, you have to be ready for him to bite back. I didn't flinch. I had lived with his bite my whole life. The first step was gathering proof. The camera footage was old, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt. The deed was stronger. And then there was the paper trail of financial transfers, all signed with his steady hand. But evidence in a locked folder meant nothing. I needed a way to make it louder than his money, louder than his control. That was when I met Liam Brooks. He wasn't a polished reporter, not the kind who wore suits and anchored the evening news. He was the kind who chased stories that nobody wanted to hear. He worked for a small local paper that had more truth than glamour. I found him through a campus board where someone had posted an article he'd written exposing a corrupt city official. I sent an anonymous email first. No name. Just the word Quinn and a hint. He responded within an hour. If this is real, meet me where the Willamette bends behind the old steel bridge. Tomorrow, 7 p.m., The night I met him, the wind off the river cut through my jacket, but I felt more alive than I had in years. Liam was taller than I expected, with tired eyes and a notebook that looked like it had been through hell. He didn't waste time. He asked questions that mattered. Who, when, how. I didn't tell him everything. I gave him enough. The forged documents, the house, the name Douglas Quinn. He didn't look surprised. "I've heard whispers about him," he said quietly. "But whispers don't survive men like that. Proof does." He tapped his notebook once. "You get me what I need. I'll make sure it's not just a whisper anymore." Back in my dorm room, I sat on the floor with everything spread out around me. The USB drive, the copies of the deeds Avery had given me, the notes from Liam, my laptop open to an encrypted folder. For years, Douglas had made sure I felt powerless. But power isn't loud. Power starts small in quiet rooms with steady hands. I was learning to build mine piece by piece. He must have sensed something. Or maybe control like his doesn't loosen easily. He started calling more often, texting, asking for receipts explanations for every withdrawal. The bank account was his leash and I could feel it tightening. So I built my own. Quiet jobs on campus, cash, small amounts tucked away where no one could trace them. He thought I was a child learning to live. I was a shadow learning to disappear. By the time spring came, I had a plan. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was precise. I met with Avery every other week. She taught me how to build a timeline that could hold in court. She showed me what judges look for, how men like Douglas manipulate paper and people. She warned me again that this would not be easy. But my fear had already burned out years ago. What remained was something colder. Liam became the other half of the strategy. He didn't just collect the evidence. He built the story. He found names of people Douglas had worked with. He traced back accounts, political donations, quiet transactions. The man who had lived like a king in Salem had left fingerprints everywhere. And all of it, every shred of it, was getting stored in a digital vault under my name. I learned how to move carefully. I used cash more often. I avoided the words that might make him suspicious on the phone. When he asked why I wasn't coming home for spring break, I told him I had too many exams. When he asked why my expenses were lower than usual, I told him I was being responsible. Every lie I gave him was dipped in the polite tone he had trained me to use. He didn't see it for what it was. A girl sharpening a blade behind a smile. One night in early May, I stood by the dorm window, watching the rain slide down the glass. Portland rain didn't feel like Salem rain. It didn't choke. It whispered. The city lights blurred into gold and silver streaks. In my hand, the USB drive felt heavier than ever. I whispered to myself, barely audible. "He doesn't own me anymore." The words weren't loud, but they were mine. I knew he was still watching me through the account, tracking the patterns of my spending, convincing himself he still held the leash. He didn't know that by the time he figured out what was coming, it would already be too late. Revenge isn't a scream. It's a quiet clock ticking in the dark, and every night in that dorm room I could hear it getting louder. I wasn't ready to strike yet, but I was building a storm one piece of evidence at a time, and I knew when it hit, it wouldn't just shake him. It would bury the empire he built on my mother's grave. It started with a phone call I didn't answer, then another, then 5 more. Each time his name flashed on the screen, the muscles in my neck tightened, not with fear the way they used to, but with a quiet recognition that the storm I'd been building had finally reached his shore. Douglas never called more than twice. He preferred control through silence and precision. But this was different. He had noticed. The money I had quietly rerouted over the past months wasn't much, just enough to create distance to make sure my life didn't begin and end inside the borders of his control. But men like Douglas notice everything, especially cracks. By the 7th call, a text arrived. Short. "We need to talk. Now." No questions. No softness. Just a demand sharpened like a blade. 3 days later, he was waiting outside my campus gate. It was early evening and the streetlights had just started to buzz alive. I saw the black SUV before I saw his face. It was the same car he'd driven for years, polished until the surface looked like glass. He stepped out in his tailored coat, his hands steady, his smile practiced. That smile had fooled neighbors, teachers, and judges, but I knew the tension behind it. I walked toward him slowly, hands buried in the pockets of my jacket, the small recorder hidden deep inside one of them already on. "You've been busy," he said, voice soft, too soft. That softness was a warning. He didn't shout. He never needed to. The power sat in the way he didn't have to raise his voice to make people fold. I stared back at him, forcing my face to stay calm, steady, unreadable. "I'm in college," I said. "Of course I'm busy." His jaw tightened just slightly. "Don't play games with me, Ember." Hearing my name in that tone felt like standing on the edge of a blade. "I've seen the withdrawals. I know you think you can hide things, but nothing in this world belongs to you without my say." He took a step closer, the faint scent of his cologne slicing through the cold air like a memory I hated. "You're coming home this weekend. We'll straighten this out. Family should talk face to face." Family. He still used that word like a shield. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. He turned back toward the car, and I knew the decision had already been made for me. The house in Salem hadn't changed. The paint was perfect, the garden trimmed, the porch light still burned warm against the dark. But the moment I stepped inside, everything in me went still. Control has a smell, a weight, a sound. It lives in the way a house remembers the shape of the person who built it. Vivian was already waiting in the living room, legs crossed, a folder on her lap. She was wearing one of those soft beige sweaters she loved, the kind that made her look like a porcelain figure. Douglas closed the door behind me with a soft click. The sound reminded me of a lock. He walked past me, poured himself a drink, and sat down like a man holding court. "Let's make this easy," he said. Vivian opened the folder. Inside were crisp legal papers, the kind printed on thick paper meant to make everything seem final. "This is just a small adjustment," Vivian said in her polished voice. "It's only fair. You don't really need all that property. It's better if it's taken care of by someone responsible." She tilted her head like she was offering me kindness, but I could see the glint in her eyes. This wasn't a request. It was the next move in his game. Douglas leaned forward slightly. "Sign it," he said simply, "and we can all move on." My fingers brushed the inside of my pocket where the recorder was hidden. It was small, no bigger than my thumb, and I had turned it on the second I walked through the door. I had learned long ago that the most dangerous moments didn't come with raised voices. They came in silk and smiles. I glanced at the papers, not reading the legal jargon I already understood too well. Signing them would strip away what remained of my mother's estate. It would make everything I'd built these last months meaningless. He must have seen the hesitation in my face because his voice dropped lower, quieter, like a noose tightening. "Don't forget who saved you," he said. Those same words he'd whispered years ago, like a mantra, meant to keep me obedient. But something in me didn't bend this time. "No," I said softly. Vivian's hand froze halfway through, turning a page. Douglas didn't move. His eyes locked onto mine, searching for the frightened girl he'd spent years training. She wasn't there. Not anymore. "You should think carefully," he said. "You don't have anyone else. You never did. Everything you have is because of me. Without me, you'd have been nothing but a charity case no one wanted." The words landed heavy, familiar. For years, they had carved themselves into my bones. But now they slid off like water. "I'm not signing," I said again. For the first time in a long time, the mask on his face cracked. Just slightly. Enough for me to see what was underneath. The hours after that blurred together into a taut, quiet tension. He started calling people. A friend from the sheriff's office came by, pretending it was a friendly visit. He offered me a ride back to campus that felt more like an escort than a kindness. Douglas knew how to weave his power through the town like a net. Salem was his territory. He didn't need force when influence was easier. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood in the hallway outside his office. The door was closed, but light leaked through the crack at the bottom. I could hear him on the phone. His voice was cold, measured the way it always was when he made things happen without leaving fingerprints. He was talking to someone at the bank, someone at the courthouse, moving pieces, pulling strings. I pressed the recorder tighter in my hand. Every word mattered now. The next morning, he tried a different tactic. Vivian cornered me in the kitchen, hands folded in front of her like a well-trained actress. He gave you everything, she said softly. He didn't have to. You know how the world works. If you fight him, you'll lose everything. He'll bury you quietly, Ember, and no one will ever know. I looked at her for a long moment. She had chosen his shadow a long time ago. That wasn't my choice. I'm not signing, I said again, steady this time. Her smile faltered. Then I hope you're ready for the consequences. Douglas didn't shout. He didn't drag me upstairs or lock me in a room. He just let the walls close in slowly. Calls to my university. Sudden bank freezes. Emails from the bursar's office about delayed payments. He didn't need a weapon. His power was paperwork and whispers. But I wasn't that 12-year-old girl on the staircase anymore. I spent the rest of that visit in silence, not because he'd won, but because I was watching, listening, collecting. The recorder in my pocket was full now. His threats, Vivian's manipulation, the quiet violence between every line. I had walked into that house prepared to face the man who had controlled my life. I walked out with something he didn't even know he'd given me. Proof. On the train ride back to Portland, I watched the gray Oregon countryside blur past the window. My phone buzzed with another message from him. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what it said. His threats were old songs. I'd heard every verse. But this time, I had the chorus. He thought his world was untouchable. But power built on fear cracks the second someone stops being afraid. And I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of him. Not of Salem. Not of the walls he built around me. I pressed my hand against my jacket where the recorder rested and whispered to the window. You don't even see it coming, do you? The first time I walked back onto the Quinn property after all those years, the air hit me like a memory I hadn't agreed to remember. The fence was the same white paint, fresh and sharp against the green of the fields, but everything about it felt smaller now, like a stage waiting for the final act. Ms. Avery was the one who insisted we meet there. You want the truth to breathe, she'd said. Make him stand where it all started. Let the walls that protected him become the walls that trap him. She had a way of saying things like that measured clear, surgical. She knew what this was not a conversation, not even a confrontation. It was an execution of a carefully built plan. We had spent weeks designing the trap. I didn't want revenge that whispered. I wanted a storm so loud it would drown out every excuse, every lie, every carefully polished version of Douglas he'd fed to the world. Avery handled the legal spine of the plan. Liam handled the pulse. He'd built a private live stream with end-to-end encryption feeding straight to an archive server, so even if something went wrong in that house, the footage would already live somewhere Douglas couldn't touch. He didn't know about the cameras we'd installed, 2 outside, 3 inside, 1 directly above the table where he would sit. It started with an invitation he couldn't resist. A polite email drafted by Avery's firm, worded like a concession meeting. A potential amicable resolution regarding the estate of Margaret Quinn. Douglas lived on power. He loved moments where he thought he was still holding the strings. I knew he would come. Vivian would follow. Men like him always bring their shadows. The night before the meeting, I stood in the empty house barefoot on the cold wood of the kitchen floor. The walls didn't echo the way they used to when I was a child. Now they just held a low hum of everything that had ever happened here. The last place my mother stood alive. The last place he told me I belonged to him. I pressed my hand against the counter. For the first time, the house didn't own me. I owned the moment. Liam was in the living room setting up the streaming rig, his fingers moving fast, practiced. Once it starts, you can't flinch, he said without looking up. He's good at turning people into the villain in their own story. You hold the ground. Let the truth do the work. Avery was at the table, papers spread out like a battle map. She wore her dark suit, the same one she wore in court, the same one that made men twice her size fold their voices into smaller shapes. She handed me the real will. My mother's signature inked in her looping handwriting. I ran my thumb over the paper like it might give me courage. The plan was simple but sharp. Douglas walks in thinking it's a negotiation. We reveal the will. He denies. We play the old camera footage. He lashes out. Cameras catch everything. Live stream archives everything, and once the words leave his mouth, there's no cage to crawl back into. It wasn't about making him confess. It was about making the world hear what I already knew. When the morning came, the sky was gray-low clouds pressing down like a lid. I sat at the table with my heart beating against my ribs, steady but hard. The front gate creaked at exactly 9:00 a.m., because of course Douglas would arrive on time. He valued appearances too much not to. The black SUV rolled in same as the day he'd taken me from this place after the ambulance lights faded. Vivian stepped out first, perfect hair, beige coat, controlled smile. Then Douglas. He walked up the porch like he owned it. He always walked like that, as if the ground bowed to him. "Ember," he said smoothly when he saw me. "I'm glad you came to your senses." I didn't answer. Avery met him at the door like a wall dressed in legal steel. "Mr. Quinn," she said crisply, "thank you for coming. Please have a seat. We have some matters to discuss." He stepped inside without hesitation. Vivian followed eyes scanning the room, but never landing on me. They didn't notice the small cameras tucked into the molding. They didn't notice Liam in the shed behind the house eyes on the feed. They didn't know the storm had already started. We sat at the table, the same table where he had poured his coffee the morning after he took everything. The same table where my mother's voice once trembled. I placed the folder on the wood, slowly, deliberately, the sound of it landing louder than it should have been. Douglas leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the backrest. "This isn't necessary," he said. "We can settle this quietly. No one has to make a mess." Avery opened the folder, slid the original will toward him. "This document is the last valid testament signed by Margaret Quinn. You are not listed as the primary beneficiary. Her children are. You never had legal ownership of this property." His jaw didn't move, but I saw the flicker in his eyes. It was fast, like a shadow passing over the sun. "That's not real," he said smoothly. "This was resolved years ago. You know that, Ember. You were there." I leaned forward slightly, letting him see the steadiness in my eyes. "I was there," I said quietly. "But I wasn't blind." Vivian shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around the handle of her purse. Douglas picked up the document, scanned it, then set it down as if it were an inconvenience rather than a threat. "Paper means nothing if no one believes it," he said softly. And that was when Avery pressed the small remote in her hand. The monitor mounted on the wall blinked to life. The footage played. The kitchen. My mother's voice. His shadow moving across the frame. The sound of her body hitting the floor. The room didn't breathe for a full 3 seconds. Vivian's face went pale. Douglas's hand twitched once the way it always did when he lost control of a moment. His mask cracked. "Where did you get that?" His voice dropped lower, the softness burned away, leaving something raw. I didn't flinch. "You kept it," I said. "All these years. You kept it hidden in your office. You thought no one would ever find it." He stood suddenly, the chair legs scraping against the floor. "You don't know what you're doing," he hissed. "This is a mistake. You think people will believe some edited video from a scared little girl I didn't rise. I didn't have to." "They already are," I said. The camera above the table caught everything, the way his face twisted, the way his hands curled against the edge of the wood, the way Vivian's composure cracked like thin glass. Liam's voice came through my earpiece low and steady. "We're live. The feed is secure. 36 people watching already. Anonymous accounts. It's moving." Douglas paced like a caged animal, now the smooth mask gone. He turned to Vivian as if expecting her to steady him, but she only stared at the screen where the grainy footage looped back to my mother's trembling voice. He slammed his hand on the table, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the quiet room. "This is over," he barked. "Shut it off." Avery didn't blink. "No," she said simply. For the first time, I saw him see me. Not as the quiet child he could control, but as someone standing across from him, holding a blade he couldn't see coming. He pointed a finger at me, the same hand that had held the pen the night he stole everything. "You don't know how the world works," he snarled. "You think this will save you. I built this town. No one will side with you." I rose slowly then. The cameras followed every inch. "I'm not trying to save myself," I said. I'm tearing down what you built." He stared at me for a long moment, the fury in him swirling like smoke trapped in a jar. Vivian whispered something too soft to catch, but I saw the fear flicker behind her polished expression. She had built her safety on his power, and now she was watching it fracture in real time. The final part of the trap was silence. We didn't need to say anything else. Liam was feeding the stream to local journalists' legal archives mirrored storage. Even if Douglas shut the power off in the house, the story had already left the walls. His empire wasn't just crumbling. It was being broadcast. He sank back into the chair, slowly breathing, hard eyes darting between me, Avery, and the glowing screen. The man who had controlled every inch of my life finally looked small. Avery's voice cut the air cleanly. "You have a choice," she said. "Cooperate or burn everything down with you. Either way, the truth is already out." And in that moment, I saw it the exact second he realized he was no longer the hunter. He was the one inside the trap. The air inside that house had changed. It wasn't just tense anymore. It was charged like the kind of stillness that lives in the split second before thunder tears through the sky. Douglas sat back in the chair, shoulders squared, eyes narrowing at me like a predator cornered but refusing to admit it. Vivian shifted uneasily beside him, her hands tight around the straps of her purse, as if she could hold on to some sense of control. The footage from the camcorder still glowed on the monitor behind me. My mother's voice played over and over, trembling but clear. That single sound was louder than anything I could have said. Liam's voice in my earpiece was steady. "We're past 200 live viewers, local IPs. It's moving fast. People are recording the feed." The world was finally listening to what had been buried for a decade. Douglas slammed his palm on the table, the sound slicing through the air like a whip. "Enough," he hissed. "This ends now." His voice was lower than I'd ever heard it, stripped of its polish. That smooth mask he wore in public was cracking, and the man underneath was the same one I'd seen the night my mother's body hit the floor. "You think this will destroy me? You think some pathetic little stream will undo everything I've built?" His laugh came out rough and bitter. "No one's going to believe a broken little girl, not after all these years." I didn't move. I didn't blink. "They're not just believing me," I said quietly. "They're watching you." Something flickered behind his eyes. Realization, then rage. He turned toward the wall where the tiny camera sat perched in the molding. "You think you're clever," he spat. "You think you can humiliate me in my own house?" "No," I said softly. "I think you already did that yourself." That was when it happened. The thing I had been waiting for. The pressure finally broke. Douglas stood up so suddenly the chair scraped back with a sharp squeal. He pointed at me, his voice rising not with practiced control, but with real anger. "You think I don't remember that night I did what I had to do?" She was hysterical. She wouldn't listen. She signed everything over because she couldn't be trusted with it. The room went still. Avery's pen stopped mid-note. Vivian froze. My heartbeat thundered in my chest, but my face didn't change. I let the words hang in the air, heavy and raw. Liam's voice came through my earpiece again. "We got it. Every word. Don't say anything. Let him dig." He kept going like a dam had finally cracked open after years of rot. "She would have ruined everything. The house, the money, all of it. I fixed it. I built this. I gave you a life you didn't deserve, Ember." His voice twisted around my name like poison. "And this is how you thank me by betraying me." I could feel the camera catching every flicker of rage in his face, every vein standing out in his neck, every truth he had buried now spilling into the world without him even realizing the door was wide open. Vivian reached for his arm, her voice small and shaking for the first time since I'd known her. "Douglas," she whispered. "Stop talking." He shoved her hand away like she was a piece of furniture in his way. "No. She wants the truth. She'll get it. I made this family. I made everything. If I hadn't stepped in, you'd still be some useless girl crying on the porch." "You mean the night you left her on the floor?" I said, my voice quiet but sharp. His mouth opened ready to twist the story again, but what came out wasn't a polished lie. It was the truth he'd spent 10 years hiding. She fell because she wouldn't stop fighting me, he snapped. I told her to stay down. She wouldn't listen. For a second, even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Avery's voice cut through the silence like steel. That's a confession, Mr. Quinn, and you just gave it to the entire town. His head whipped toward her, confusion flashing across his face, as if he hadn't fully processed what he'd said. Then his eyes shot back to me, and I saw it the exact second the realization landed. His empire wasn't just shaking, it was collapsing in real time. He lunged for the table, reaching for the monitor as if tearing it off the wall could pull the words back. Vivian gasped. Liam's voice in my ear was calm, almost too calm. Every second's already archived. It's not going away. Vivian scrambled toward the corner of the room where one of the cameras was hidden in the molding. Turn it off, she shouted, her polished mask cracking completely. Turn it off now. She reached up and ripped the small black lens out of the wall wires, snapping in her hand. But it didn't matter. It was already too late. The feed was running through Liam's laptop in the shed and mirrored to half a dozen servers. Douglas spun back toward me, his face flushed with a kind of rage I hadn't seen since I was a child. Do you have any idea what you've done? He barked. Yes, I said. I've told the truth. He reached across the table, his hand slamming down inches from mine, the weight of it shaking the wood. His breath was hot, his voice low and vicious. You're nothing without me. This is my house, my name, my legacy. I leaned forward just enough for the cameras to catch his face, our eyes locked. Not anymore. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the air, then faint at first, then louder. Liam's voice came through the earpiece. They're already on their way. Someone watching the stream called it in. Multiple people, actually. Vivian turned toward the window, her face pale mouth opening and closing without sound. Douglas straightened slowly, trying to rebuild the mask he had just shattered, but it was too late. The internet doesn't forget. The truth doesn't return quietly to its box once it's out. You think this will end with me in handcuffs, he spat. I'll bury you, Ember. I'll burn everything you care about. I stood up slowly, letting the chair legs scrape against the floor. You already did. 10 years ago. The sound of heavy boots hitting the porch broke the last thread of silence. Uniformed officers stepped through the front door, their radios crackling. They didn't knock. They didn't ask. They walked in like men who had seen the footage before they even got there. The lead officer's eyes went straight to me, then to Douglas, then to the monitor still frozen on his own face mid-confession. Douglas Quinn, the officer said evenly. You need to come with us. For the first time in my life, I saw something unfamiliar on Douglas's face. Not arrogance, not anger, not even hate. It was fear. He tried to speak, to twist it one last time, but the handcuffs clicked around his wrists with a clean, undeniable sound. Vivian pressed herself against the wall, her mascara streaking down her cheeks, whispering his name like it might undo everything. It didn't. As they walked him out, cameras still rolling, I didn't move. I didn't gloat. I didn't scream. I just breathed. Deep, steady, unshaking. Outside, the rain had started to fall light, at first tapping against the porch, like the house itself was exhaling after years of holding its breath. Liam stepped into the doorway, then rain in his hair, his camera still strapped to his chest. It's done, he said quietly. They've seen everything. Avery placed a hand on my shoulder. Not as a lawyer, not as someone who helped build a case, but as someone who understood what 10 years of silence breaking really sounded like. I walked to the window and watched as they guided Douglas into the back of the patrol car. The man who had convinced an entire town he was untouchable was now just a figure behind glass and steel. His eyes found mine one last time as the door closed. I didn't look away. For 10 years, the truth lived in the dark. And now it was standing in the rain, screaming into the world. And the world was finally listening. The sound of the rain was soft, the morning after the kind of quiet drizzle that feels more like a cleansing than a storm. The house didn't hum with fear anymore. For the first time in a decade, it was just a house, not a cage, not a stage for someone else's power. I sat on the porch, wrapped in an old wool blanket barefoot, staring at the long stretch of gravel driveway where everything had changed the night before. The flashing lights were gone. The porch was quiet. But the echo of those handcuffs closing around Douglas's wrists still lived in the air like a scar being acknowledged. He was in custody at the Marion County Detention Center, now awaiting arraignment. They'd held him overnight without bail, which was something I never thought I'd see. Men like Douglas don't go quietly. They build networks, they make calls, they pull strings. But last night, all those strings had snapped. His face was plastered across local news sites by midnight. The headline on Liam's paper said it plain and sharp: Douglas Quinn arrested after live-stream confession. It was the kind of headline that people whispered about in grocery stores, the kind that ripples through a town and makes it stop pretending. Vivian was still in shock when they led her away for questioning. She wasn't handcuffed, but the way she walked, stiff, small, broken, told me she understood her place in this was no longer invisible. They'd found bank transfers, recorded calls, witness statements from neighbors who had never seen anything but suddenly remembered more when faced with a microphone and the undeniable footage. Silence always cracks when truth becomes louder. By the time the sun rose, the town wasn't whispering anymore. Reporters lined the road outside the property. Satellite vans flashing cameras, voices shouting questions through the gate. Liam stood in the driveway with his press badge clipped to his jacket, speaking calmly to a camera. His live stream from last night had hit over 40,000 views by dawn. It wasn't a national headline yet, but it was coming. The kind of story where a man who thought he was untouchable confesses to everything because for the first time in his life, he forgot to control the narrative. Avery walked out onto the porch, holding 2 mugs of coffee. Her hair was still damp from the rain, her black suit jacket replaced with a soft gray sweater. For the first time, she didn't look like the lawyer who had built this case with precision. She just looked like someone who understood what justice actually felt like. Not loud, not triumphant, but bone deep and quiet. She handed me a mug, and we sat there for a long moment, listening to the rain drip from the roof. The DA's office moved fast, she said finally. They're building formal charges: fraud, coercion, assault, manipulation of legal documents, obstruction. The confession made it a lot cleaner than I expected. The live stream is already under evidentiary preservation orders. She paused, looking at me with a small smile that wasn't about celebration, but about something steadier. He won't walk away from this. For years I had imagined what justice might feel like. I thought it would be loud, explosive, a punch through the dark. But sitting there on that porch, it felt like breathing without weight on my chest for the first time since I was 12. Vivian's name was already trending locally. She wasn't charged yet, but the investigation was moving fast. Detectives had spent the night collecting everything from their house emails, financial records, security footage. She had played the quiet accomplice for too long, and quiet has consequences too. Liam came up the steps, his sneakers soaked from the wet gravel camera slung around his neck. He looked exhausted but charged in that way reporters get when they've just dropped a story that shakes the ground. "Morning," he said softly, almost as if not to break the strange, fragile peace of the porch. "You made the front page." Again. I said, voice low. He smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile people give when they win. It was the kind people give when something that should have happened years ago finally happens. The phones at the paper didn't stop ringing. People who grew up with him, people who worked with him. It's like the whole town just woke up overnight. Avery nodded slowly. That's how power collapses. One stone gets pulled out, the rest falls on its own. I thought about that for a long moment, my eyes following the line of the fence. He had built his reputation like that fence, clean, perfect, whitewashed. But the foundation beneath it was rot. And once rot is exposed, it doesn't just disappear. It spreads fast. Within 24 hours, the DA announced a press conference. Douglas Quinn, former local developer and long-standing philanthropist, was formally charged on multiple felony counts. Vivian Quinn was listed as a cooperating witness under investigation. Every polite mask they had worn for years shattered in the morning light of public scrutiny. Their friends stopped answering calls. Business partners issued quiet statements. The dominoes fell exactly the way Avery said they would. By the second day, the court confirmed what she had promised me months earlier. The original will was reinstated as the valid legal document. All forged transfers were void. The Quinn property, the land, the house, everything was legally mine and Ethan's again. For the first time in 10 years, the land didn't feel like it belonged to someone else. It felt like it was breathing again. Ethan flew back from Colorado that night. When I saw him step out of the car at the gate, taller, older, with tired eyes that still carried the boy who'd once held my hand in the kitchen while everything burned down, I almost couldn't speak. He didn't say anything either. He just walked up the steps, wrapped his arms around me, and let the silence between us say everything. 10 years of separation had lived in that silence. But now, it wasn't silence built on fear. It was silence built on relief. The news coverage grew. It started in Salem, then Portland, then spread. The image of Douglas being led into custody in handcuffs played on loop. People who used to look away were now looking straight at the truth. Neighbors who had pretended not to hear my mother's cries were on camera, saying they always had a bad feeling. And though it burned a little to hear them rewrite their own courage, I didn't need their validation. The truth wasn't for them. It was for her. I spent that afternoon sitting on the porch while Avery and Liam handled the storm outside statements, interviews, legal logistics. The rain had lightened to a mist, the kind that sticks to your skin like a reminder you're still here. Reporters kept trying to call my name from the gate. I didn't answer. Some stories don't need to be told by press releases. Some stories breathe better in silence. Inside the house, workers were already pulling down old security systems, taking inventory of everything he had built here to keep control. The sheriff's office executed a search warrant, finding hidden files in the basement old recordings account ledgers that stretched back years. His empire was rotting from the inside, and now everyone could see it. That night, I walked barefoot through the halls. The floor creaked the way it used to when I was a child, but it didn't make my chest tighten anymore. It just sounded like wood. Like a house being a house again. When I reached the kitchen, I paused. The counter was still the same. The tiles still held faint cracks from the night she fell. For years, I couldn't step into this room without feeling like I was drowning. Now I just stood there and let the quiet in. Ethan came in behind me, leaning against the doorway. "I didn't think we'd ever come back here," he said softly. "Me neither," I whispered. He tilted his head toward the porch. "You okay?" I looked at him at the kitchen at the house that no longer belonged to him, the man who'd haunted every inch of our childhood. "I think so," I said. "Or at least I'm learning how to be." The news reports played in the background all night. Douglas's face on every screen, his recorded confession on every platform. And beneath it all, a single, quiet truth had finally settled into place. He couldn't hurt anyone from behind bars. Justice didn't come like a bolt of lightning. It came like rain, slow, quiet, persistent, washing away years of rot one drop at a time. Before I went to bed, I stepped back out onto the porch, pulling the blanket around my shoulders again. The rain had finally stopped. The air smelled like wet earth and old wood. For the first time since I was 12 years old, I let myself cry. Not the shaking, terrified kind of crying I'd done as a child, but a slow, quiet release. It wasn't about victory. It was about breathing again. The house behind me wasn't a weapon anymore. It was mine. Ethan's. My mother's memory. Liam's headline the next day captured it better than I ever could. The town stayed silent. The truth didn't. And as the world outside spun with trials, lawyers, and press, I sat on that porch, letting the quiet wrap around me like something I had earned. Because justice isn't loud. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just stands quietly where the pain began and it stays. 8 months after the trial began, the house didn't hum with tension anymore. The white fence was still there, the porch creaked the same way when I stepped onto it, and the same Oregon rain misted over the fields, but something had shifted. Time has a way of changing the air around old wounds, softening the sharp edges without erasing them. I still woke up some nights with the sound of her voice in my ears, but it no longer broke me. It steadied me. It reminded me why I did what I did. That morning, the mailbox creaked as I opened it, and there it was, an envelope stamped with the name of the Marion County Correctional Facility. My hands didn't shake when I held it. They used to. Now they were steady calm. I walked back inside, set the letter on the kitchen table, and made myself a cup of coffee. The house was quiet. Ethan was visiting friends in Colorado. Avery was in court for another case Liam was working on a follow-up article. It was just me, the house, and that letter. I didn't open it right away. I let the steam from the mug curl upward slow and soft. I stared at the envelope like it was a remnant of a world that didn't belong to me anymore. Eventually, I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out the paper. His handwriting was still neat, precise, the way he used to write his checks and contracts when I was a child, and watched from the corner of the room, trying to disappear. Ember, I know you don't owe me anything. I know I made mistakes. I know what I did to your mother was wrong. I know what I did to you was wrong. I have 8 months to think about it every day. I can't sleep. I see her face. I see yours. I'm asking you for one thing, not forgiveness, just mercy. If you ask the court to lessen the sentence, maybe I can live out what's left of my life somewhere that doesn't feel like a cage. I'm an old man, Ember. Please, don't let this be the end of me. Douglas. The words were clean polished, constructed like every deal he'd ever made. But beneath them, I could smell the fear. The kind of fear men like him never show until the walls are too high to climb. I folded the letter slowly, placed it back in the envelope, and set it on the counter. The idea of mercy from him was almost laughable. The man who spent years controlling every inch of my life had finally found a cage he couldn't build his way out of. 3 days later, Vivian came. I saw her car through the kitchen window, still the same cream-colored sedan she'd always driven, spotless and shining against the gray afternoon sky. She didn't call ahead. She never did. She just showed up the way ghosts sometimes do, quiet but heavy. I opened the door before she could knock. She stood on the porch in a beige trench coat, a soft scarf around her neck, her hands gripping her purse too tightly. Her hair was a little grayer, her face thinner, but the sharpness in her eyes hadn't changed. "Ember," she said softly. "Vivian," I answered, keeping my voice level. She shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the porch, the door anywhere but my face. "May I come in?" "No," I said. She blinked at the word like it was foreign to her. "I just want to talk." Then talk. For a second, she just stood there gathering the courage she should have used years ago. "He's not the same man anymore," she finally said. "Prison changes people. He's old Ember. He's sick. He's asking for mercy. He wants to see the end of his life outside those walls." I let the silence stretch between us long enough for her to hear the rain tapping against the porch. "He's asking me," I said finally. After everything he did, Vivian lowered her eyes. "I know what happened. I'm not pretending it wasn't terrible. But he saved you after stop." My voice didn't rise, but it cut through her like glass. "He didn't save me. He took everything that wasn't his and called it love. He turned my life into a story he could control." She pressed her lips together, her voice trembling slightly. "He's old Ember, and he's dying in there. Can't you let it go?" I stepped closer to the doorway, the cool air brushing my face. I was wearing a gray suit that day, pressed and sharp, the kind I wore to meetings with Avery about managing the property. It wasn't about fashion. It was about presence. The girl he broke no longer lived here. I did let it go, I said evenly. "But the law won't." Her face faltered at that. She'd expected tears or anger or maybe guilt. But I had none left for them. Only truth. "He wrote you too, didn't he?" I asked quietly. She hesitated, then nodded. "And you came here thinking I would be the soft one." Her silence was answer enough. "Go home, Vivian." She stared at me for a moment longer, eyes flicking between the house behind me and the woman standing in the doorway. Then she nodded once slowly, as if something inside her finally cracked open too. She turned, walked down the steps, and drove away. The sentencing hearing was 2 weeks later. Avery sat next to me at the long wooden bench, calm and unreadable as always. Liam sat a few rows back with his notebook and camera, not as a reporter this time, but as a friend. Ethan was beside him, quiet but steady, his hand resting on the back of the bench behind me. The courtroom felt different than it had a year earlier. Not heavier, lighter, like the space itself had stopped holding its breath. Douglas entered in the orange jumpsuit, thinner than I remembered hair, more gray skin, sallow. He shuffled instead of walked. For a second, I saw the man he used to pretend to be the powerful one, the polished one, the man who made the town bend to his will. Now he was just a man in chains. He scanned the courtroom, his gaze landing on me, searching for something that wasn't there anymore. His lawyer stood and began to speak, listing his age, his supposed medical issues, his clean record prior to his crimes, his years of service to the community, the same community he had manipulated into silence. And then they read the letter he had sent me line by line. I didn't flinch. I didn't even look down. When it was my turn, I didn't make a speech about pain or forgiveness. I stood, hands folded in front of me, voice steady. I spent 10 years living in the shadow of a man who believed consequences were for other people. He stole my mother's life. He stole mine. He built walls and expected the world to thank him for it. And when those walls finally fell, he asked for mercy. But he never gave it to anyone else. I don't want vengeance. I want the law to do what it's supposed to do. Nothing more. Nothing less. The judge nodded slowly, the sound of the gavel soft but final. Douglas Quinn, she said, you are hereby sentenced to 28 years in state prison without the possibility of parole. The words rolled through the courtroom like a wave. Douglas didn't yell. He didn't beg. He just lowered his head slightly, the weight of inevitability finally settling on his shoulders. Vivian was in the back row. She covered her mouth with her hand, but didn't stand. She didn't speak. As they led him away, his eyes found mine, one last time. They weren't filled with hate, just a quiet, desperate plea. The same kind of plea that letter had carried. But I had nothing left to give him. He had taken too much already. I turned away before the door closed behind him. Outside the courthouse, the reporters were waiting. Microphones, cameras, flashing lights, questions thrown like stones. I didn't answer any of them. I walked down the steps with Avery and Ethan on either side of me. Liam trailed behind his camera at his side. Someone shouted my name. Another shouted, "Do you forgive him?" I stopped at the bottom of the steps, turned my head slightly, and spoke just loud enough for the microphones to catch it. Forgiveness doesn't mean freedom from consequence. The air was cold and clean, the sun breaking weakly through the gray clouds. 8 months ago, the world felt like it was pressing against my ribs. Now it felt wide open. I wasn't a prisoner of his house anymore. I wasn't the girl on the stairs. I wasn't the shadow in his story. I was the ending he didn't get to write. Vivian didn't come back after that day. I never answered the follow-up letters from the prison. Some stories don't deserve sequels. Some endings are meant to stay closed. That night, I stood on the porch again, the sky turning to a deep blue. I thought about my mother, about the little girl who had stood on this same porch barefoot, watching an ambulance disappear into the dark, about the woman standing there now in a gray suit with her head high and her hands steady. Justice hadn't erased the scars. It had carved space for something else to grow around them. Not pity, not bitterness, just peace. Inside, the letter from Douglas lay in a drawer where it couldn't hurt anyone. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a promise. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was surviving. I felt like I was free. The morning I turned 22, the sky over Salem stretched wide and pale, the kind of spring sky that feels like a beginning, even when the past still hums beneath the surface. The porch boards were warm under my bare feet, and the air smelled faintly of rain and cedar. The house behind me didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It was just a house. My house. The creak in the third step no longer made my shoulders tense. The sound of wind tapping against the window didn't tighten my chest. This place, which had once been soaked in fear, finally belonged to me in a way that went deeper than legal papers. The front lawn had been redone over the past months. The rotten fence was replaced, the windows fixed, the roof patched. Ethan and I spent weekends scraping away old paint, planting roses near the mailbox the way Mom used to talk about. I remember standing there one afternoon with dirt on my hands, watching the first buds push through the soil and realizing I wasn't waiting for something bad to happen anymore. That kind of silence, clean silence, was new to me. It's strange how spaces hold memory. For years, this porch held nothing but echoes of shouting, of slammed doors, of everything that broke us. Now it held something else. The sound of birds, the smell of coffee, my quiet breathing. I leaned against the railing, looking out at the gravel road where that black SUV had once parked, where flashing lights had filled the night. And for the first time, the memory didn't burn. It just existed. A page that had already turned. Inside, a box of old photographs sat open on the table. I had spent the last few weeks going through it slowly, not out of obligation, but out of something gentler. Among the old yellowed snapshots of the house and the fields, I found one of Mom sitting on this same porch with a mug in her hands, sunlight catching her hair. She wasn't bruised or tired in that photo. She was laughing. The sound didn't live in my memory, but looking at it, I could almost feel it. I used to think remembering her would always come with a blade, that every image of her face would be tied to the night she fell. But as I traced the edges of the photo that morning for the first time, the pain didn't rise. There was only warmth. She had existed before the fear, before the walls before him. And that part of her had always lived somewhere in me, quiet, waiting for the noise to end. Liam came by just before noon, his hands in his jacket pockets, a printout folded under his arm. He'd been working on something for weeks but hadn't told me what. He walked up the steps and handed me the paper without saying a word. The title was simple: She Didn't Burn for Revenge. She burned for truth. His article filled the front page of the Sunday edition. It wasn't about Douglas. It wasn't about the crime. It was about the 10 years that came after, about the quiet ways the truth claws its way out of silence, about what it means for a small town to look away and what it means when someone refuses to disappear. My name was in the headline, but it didn't feel like a spectacle. It felt like closure printed in black and white. "You didn't have to write this," I said softly, my thumb brushing the edge of the page. "I did," he answered, leaning on the railing beside me. "Some stories need to be told right. Not for him. Not for them. For you. For her." We stood there in the quiet for a long time. I didn't need to say thank you. He already knew. Ethan joined us later that afternoon, pulling up in his truck with the same easy grin he'd had since we were kids. He still carried the weight of the years too, but it sat differently on him now, lighter. He walked through the gate, looked up at the house, and whistled low. "Doesn't look like the same place anymore." "It isn't," I said. He wrapped an arm around my shoulders, warm and steady. "She'd be proud of you, Em." For a long time, I didn't answer. I didn't have to. I just let the sun hit my face and closed my eyes, breathing it in. That night, I walked through the house one last time. My bag was already packed by the door. Law school in Portland started in 2 weeks. I hadn't told many people. It wasn't about running away. It was about stepping forward. I ran my fingers across the banister, the polished wood warm beneath my skin. The old wall clock in the hallway still ticked the same way it always had a sound that used to make my chest ache. Now it sounded like time moving forward. I stopped in the kitchen. The tiles were still cracked in the corner where it had all happened. I never replaced them, not out of attachment, but because not every scar needs to be hidden. Some scars just live quietly where they are proof that the wound is no longer open. I placed my hand flat against the cool surface, closed my eyes, and whispered, "I'm still here, Mom." Upstairs, my old room was packed. Boxes labeled and taped. The posters on the wall were long gone, replaced with bare white paint and sunlight spilling in through clean windows. I used to dream of leaving this place like someone running from a fire. Now I was walking away like someone who had finally turned off the alarm. Before bed, I stepped out onto the porch again. The moon hung low, pale and round, bathing the fields in soft light. The wind moved through the trees with a sound that felt more like a lullaby than a warning. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and let the quiet settle in my bones. Forgiveness isn't always a word you say. Sometimes it's just a breath you take without flinching. Sometimes it's the way a house finally feels like home again. I thought about the girl I used to be, 12 years old, barefoot on this same porch, clutching Ethan's hand, listening to the distant sirens. That girl thought the world ended that night. She didn't know yet that sometimes endings are just long beginnings. Liam's article went live online that night. I didn't check the numbers, but the messages started coming in the next morning. Strangers, survivors, people who'd lived in silence for too long. They didn't call me brave, they called me something else. Real. That word sat heavier in my chest than any praise could. I didn't respond to most of them, but I read every line. Because they reminded me that the shadow he cast didn't stretch as far as it once did. It had edges now, edges that light could slip through. Ethan and I spent the next few days packing the last boxes. I left most of the furniture behind. It wasn't about escaping the past. It was about not carrying its weight where it didn't belong anymore. On my last morning in the house, I walked down the porch steps barefoot. The grass was wet with dew, cool against my feet. I stood at the gate, looking back at the house. It was quiet, whole. Mine, I whispered. Goodbye, but it didn't feel like loss. It felt like opening a door. When the car pulled away, the sun rose through the trees, hitting the windows of the house just right. For a second, the light reflected like the house itself was exhaling. I didn't look back again. Portland wasn't far, just a drive away, but it felt like another world. Law school wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure people like him didn't get to live in silence anymore. I wanted to build the kind of life where girls like I once was didn't have to wait 10 years for the world to listen. As the highway stretched out in front of me, I let the wind push through the open window and fill the car. I thought of Liam's headline. She didn't burn for revenge, she burned for truth. And that was exactly right. Because this story was never about his end, it was about my beginning, and it was just getting started. Some shadows don't disappear overnight. They linger in corners in the quiet, in the way your breath catches at a sound that used to mean danger. But when the truth finally steps into the light, monsters can't hide anymore. They shrink, they lose their shape. And what's left behind is not fear. It's space. Space to breathe, to live, to start again. The morning sun poured over the fields like warm honey, turning every blade of grass into a line of gold. I stood at the edge of the gate, one hand resting on the old wooden post, feeling the grain of it beneath my fingers. For years, this gate had been the line between captivity and escape. Now it was neither. It was just a gate, a way forward. Behind me stood the house that had held both the worst nights and the beginning of my freedom. Ahead of me, a road stretching toward a life that wasn't defined by someone else's cruelty. The breeze lifted my hair gently, and for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I was walking toward something. I took one step forward, then another, my boots pressing into the damp earth. The sun climbed higher, warm against my shoulders. For a long time, I thought healing would feel like some grand explosion, like something cinematic and loud, but it wasn't. It was this. Quiet, solid, unshakable. As I reached the gate, I turned back just once, not out of regret, but out of respect. The house stood there in the light, no longer a ghost. It didn't need me to stay anymore, and I didn't need it to remind me who I was. I pushed the gate open, the hinges creaking softly. A sound that once froze me in place now felt like the beginning of something new. The world beyond was waiting, and this time I wasn't afraid to walk into it. If you believe justice always finds its way, tap the heart and share this story. Where are you watching from? As I stepped fully through the gate and felt the sunlight break across my shoulders, I let the door swing shut behind me. 10 years of silence, fear, and shadows had ended where they began. But this time, the ending was mine.